She had learned, somewhere between her 38th birthday and the morning she stood in the county assessor's office with 8 crumpled dollars in her coat pocket, that dignity was not the same thing as ease. Dignity was what remained when ease had long since walked out the door. She carried it the way she carried everything else, quietly, without announcement, with a kind of practiced steadiness that people who had never struggled often mistook for contentment. Her name was Miriam, and she lived on the eastern edge of a small county that the state had mostly forgotten. The kind of place where roads developed potholes in February and did not get repaired until August, where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on a good day, and where the people who stayed did so not always by choice, but because leaving required a kind of momentum they could not always muster. She had 2 children, a daughter of 14 and a son of 11. She raised them alone in a rental house on Creel Street, a house that belonged to a landlord who lived in another city and communicated exclusively through handwritten notices that arrived in envelopes with no return address. She worked 2 jobs. During the week, she cleaned offices for a commercial janitorial company that paid hourly, docked minutes for clock-in delays, and offered no benefits beyond the right to continue working. On weekends, she drove 40 miles to a processing plant where she sorted materials on a conveyor line alongside 12 other people, most of whom she recognized but did not know well enough to call friends. Between those 2 jobs, she managed her children's school schedules, kept the house from falling below a standard she refused to let slip, and slept in intervals that she could never quite string into something that felt like rest. Money moved through her life the way water moves through cupped hands. It arrived, and before she could close her fingers around it, most of it was already gone. Rent, utilities, groceries, school fees, the car insurance that she paid in monthly installments because the full amount was something she had not been able to look at directly in years. What remained after all of that was not enough to build anything from. It was only enough to make the next month possible, and barely that. She did not complain. And this was not stubbornness or pride in the conventional sense. It was something quieter, a recognition that complaining consumed the same energy that keeping things together required, and she did not have enough of either to spend carelessly. The water tower had stood on the edge of town for longer than most people could reliably remember. It rose from a flat parcel of land at the end of Harmon Road, separated from the nearest property by a stretch of untended grass that turned yellow in summer and gray in winter. The tower itself was old iron, riveted and bolted in the manner of things built when engineers had not yet learned to disguise their work behind smooth surfaces. It stood perhaps 60 feet tall, its legs spreading outward at the base like a figure bracing against wind. The tank at the top was round and swollen-looking, its surface spotted with rust that had bloomed and spread over the decades into something almost botanical. The town had decommissioned it years ago when the water district completed a new infrastructure system that routed service through modern pipes. After that, the tower simply stood, as decommissioned things tend to do, accumulating weather and indifference in equal measure. The county eventually took possession when the private company that had originally built it dissolved without leaving a clear heir to the property. For a while there had been talk of restoration, then of demolition, then of nothing at all. The file sat in a drawer. The tower sat on Harmon Road. Both gathered dust in their respective ways. When it appeared on the county's surplus list, it was priced at $8. The figure was not symbolic. It reflected the county's desire to transfer liability rather than generate revenue. Whoever purchased the property took on full responsibility for whatever the structure demanded. Environmental assessment, demolition if required. Any complications that revealed themselves after the sale. No assistance, no warranties, no recourse. The tower was sold strictly as it stood, which was to say precariously. Miriam saw the listing on a Wednesday evening. She had come home late from the processing plant, still wearing the clothes she had worked in, standing in her kitchen with the refrigerator open because she was too tired to decide what she wanted from it. Her daughter had left the county's public notice flyer on the table. The child had been going through a phase of reading everything she could find, including legal notices, and which Miriam had always found both reassuring and vaguely alarming. She picked up the flyer without particular intention. She read through the listings the way one reads the back of a cereal box without expecting to find anything worth retaining. But the water tower stopped her. Not because of the price, though $8 was a number that had its own gravitational pull when you had spent years watching larger numbers disappear. It stopped her because she recognized the address. She had driven past the tower on Harmon Road hundreds of times. She knew what it looked like. She knew the way it caught the late afternoon light in late autumn, the rust giving its surface a warmth that the structure itself could not have intended. She knew the way it seemed to lean slightly, just slightly, as if it had grown tired of standing upright for so long. She had noticed all of that in the passive way one notices things that are simply part of the landscape without investing any particular meaning in them. Standing in her kitchen, flyer in hand, something shifted. She put the refrigerator door closed without taking anything from it and sat down at the table. She read the listing 3 more times. The acreage that came with the tower was minimal, less than a quarter acre, but it was land. The structure itself was condemned by the county for occupancy, which meant no one could live inside it. Not that the idea of living inside a water tower had occurred to her. But condemned did not mean worthless. Condemned meant the county had washed its hands of it. It meant the county wanted it to belong to someone else. $8, where she turned the flyer over and looked at the blank backside for a moment. Then she folded it once and placed it under the salt shaker on the table. She did not sleep easily that night. The thought of the tower kept returning, not urgently but persistently, the way a song lyric will repeat itself in a register just below full attention. She tried to reason with herself. She had no use for a water tower. She had no equipment, no expertise, no resources to do anything meaningful with a condemned iron structure on a quarter-acre lot at the end of a road that most people in town couldn't have located on a map without pausing to think. The practical objections assembled themselves readily and stood in a patient line, waiting to be acknowledged. But underneath them was something that was harder to argue with. She thought about what the tower represented beyond its physical form. A piece of land, however small, something that would be hers in a way that the rental house on Creel Street never could be. Something that no landlord in another city could terminate with a letter in a windowless envelope. $8 would not empty her account. $8 was a risk that could be absorbed. She also thought about her children, the way she often thought about her children when she was trying to decide whether a thing was worth doing. Her daughter was 14 and already beginning to understand the specific texture of their circumstances in ways that Miriam found both moving and heartbreaking. Her son was 11 and still possessed of the kind of optimism that had not yet been tested by sustained disappointment. She thought about what it would mean, in some longer and less definable sense, to own a thing, to have claimed something from the world rather than simply waiting for the world to offer less than it had the month before. She got up at 5:30 in the morning and drove to Harmon Road before the children woke. The tower in the early morning was different from the tower she had catalogued from a moving car. Standing at the edge of the property, in the thin gray light that precedes sunrise, it was larger than she remembered. The legs disappeared into the ground at concrete footings that had cracked in places, the edges ragged with age. The crossbeams that connected the legs to each other were heavy iron, bolted through with hardware that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Above all of it, the tank rose against a pale sky, its silhouette unambiguous and oddly assertive, as if it were fully aware of its own presence. She stood there for several minutes without moving. The air was cold and carried the smell of the dormant grass, and somewhere beneath that the faint mineral smell of iron, which she would later come to associate specifically with this place. No cars passed on Harmon Road at that hour. No sound reached her from the town. It was just her and the tower and the slow brightening of the sky above it. She drove back home, woke her children, made their breakfasts, and took them to school. Then she went to the county assessor's office. The clerk who processed the sale was a man in his mid-50s who wore reading glasses pushed down toward the end of his nose and who did not look up from his computer screen when she came to the window. He entered information, printed forms, accepted her $8 in the same motion a person uses to accept change at a toll booth, automatically, without registering the human on the other side of the transaction. When he slid the receipt across the counter, he finally glanced at her. "You know it's condemned," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for another moment with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite curiosity, but something in between, the look people give when they have processed enough transactions to recognize a decision that seems unlikely to end well but is not their responsibility to prevent. "Property maintenance is your obligation from today," he said. "I understand," she said. She took the receipt and folded it into her coat pocket alongside her hands. And the news spread the way news spreads in a small county, not through any deliberate act of communication, but through the quiet osmosis of people who live close together and have long since stopped keeping secrets from one another by accident. Someone saw her at the assessor's office. Someone else asked what she had been doing there. The story passed from mouth to mouth and arrived, as these things do, slightly larger and more interpretable than it had begun. The responses were varied in tone but consistent in direction. A woman who lived 3 houses down on Creel Street came to her door on a Thursday evening to tell her, with genuine concern in her voice, that the tower had been cited multiple times by the county for structural instability. "The legs," she said, as if the word carried the weight of a diagnosis, the legs were compromised. The Miriam thanked her and closed the door gently. One of her supervisors at the janitorial company heard the story from someone he knew in the county office. He pulled her aside between assignments on a Friday morning and told her, in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor, that she was throwing good money after bad, except in this case there was no good money, only bad, and $8 might as well be $8,000 given what she'd likely have to pay to get out from under it. Miriam nodded and told him she appreciated the perspective. The harder conversations were the ones that happened in passing. At the school pickup line, at the grocery store on the east side where she did her shopping because it was cheaper than the one near the center of town. People did not always intend to be unkind. That was the most precise thing she could say about it. They were curious in the way that people are curious when they observe a decision they cannot account for, and curiosity, when it is not accompanied by imagination, can feel indistinguishable from dismissal. One man she had known for years, a neighbor who prided himself on having a practical understanding of things, stopped her on the sidewalk outside the hardware store and delivered a short speech on the subject of liability. He used the word liability 4 times. He used the phrase, "at your expense," twice. When he was finished, he shook his head in a way that was meant to communicate regret, but communicated something else instead. She thanked him and continued into the hardware store. She bought a padlock, a heavy-duty flashlight, a new pair of work gloves, and a box of contractor trash bags. The total came to $31 and change, which she paid with cash and did not let herself think about for the rest of the day. That Saturday, she drove to Harmon Road alone. The children were at a school event that would keep them occupied until afternoon. She had not told them about the tower yet. She was not sure why, except that the right words had not yet assembled themselves, and she was not the kind of person who spoke before she understood what she was trying to say. She parked at the edge of the property and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the structure. It looked the same as it had on the morning she had come to assess it. Of course it did. Things did not change because they had changed owners. The tower did not know it belonged to her, and the iron did not feel the transfer of the receipt. It simply stood where it had always stood and continued being what it had always been. She got out of the car and put on the work gloves. The property had no fence, only the vague suggestion of a boundary formed by the difference in ground level where the maintained surface of the road shoulder ended and the rougher, wilder grass of the lot began. She walked the perimeter first, slowly, hands at her sides, studying the base of each leg. The concrete footings were in worse condition up close than they appeared from the road. The cracks, she had noticed, were deeper on the north side, where drainage had been poor over the years and frost had done its patient work. She crouched beside one footing and pressed her fingers into a crack. The concrete gave a faint powdered resistance, and suggesting it was more compromised than it appeared even from this distance. She stood and looked upward along the length of one leg. The riveted iron was corroded along its surface, but corrosion and failure were different things. She had learned that much in years of working around industrial equipment. A surface could look devastated and still be structurally sound. What mattered was not appearance but function, not what the iron looked like, but what it was still capable of holding. She circled the base of the tower twice, then moved to the ladder. The access ladder was bolted to one of the legs, a narrow vertical run of iron rungs that extended from the ground to a small platform just below the tank access hatch. She tested the lowest rung with her foot before trusting it with her weight, pressing gradually, listening for any sound of give or separation. It held. She moved upward slowly, pausing every few rungs to assess the next section. Her body pressed close to the leg for stability in the wind that moved more freely up here than it did at the ground. The view from the platform was the kind that arrives without warning and makes a person stop. She had not expected it. The county spread out in every direction, flat in some places and rolling in others, cut through by the road she had driven in on, and others she could trace from memory without being able to name from this height. The town was visible to the west, its water tower, the new one, modern and bland, rising from a cluster of industrial buildings near the rail line. In every other direction, the land offered itself without comment, indifferent to observation, going about whatever land goes about when people are not paying attention to it. She stood on the platform for longer than she had planned. Then she looked at the access hatch. It was a round iron door set into the underside of the tank, approximately 3 feet in diameter, sealed with a locking mechanism that had long since rusted to a shade of deep reddish brown. A padlock, separate from the tank's own locking lever, had been attached at some point. Newer looking than the rest of the hardware, though that was not saying much, and was closed. She had not been given a key. The assessor's office had provided no key. She had not thought to ask, and they had not thought to mention it. She examined the lock for a long moment, then descended the ladder. Back on the ground, she walked around the base of the tower more slowly this time. Looking not at the structure itself, but at the ground around it. Decades of standing in one place meant decades of accumulation. At the base of the northwest leg, she found a scattering of old paint chips, faded to something between orange and gray. Near the southeast footing, a section of the ground was slightly lower than the surrounding area, a subtle depression that suggested water had pooled here repeatedly over years, perhaps from a drainage point on the tank above. She filed the detail without yet assigning it meaning. She also found, half buried under a mat of dead grass that had compressed itself against the concrete of the northeast footing, a rusted tin box. It was small, perhaps the size of a thick book, its lid sealed by decades of rust and moisture. She picked it up and shook it gently. Something inside shifted. Not loose debris. Something deliberate. Something that had been placed rather than having settled. She held the box in her gloved hands and looked at it for a long time. She put it in the car. On her drive home, she passed 3 people she recognized. One waved. One did not see her. One watched her drive by with an expression she could not read from a moving car, and did not try to interpret. She thought about the box, the hatch, the view from the platform. She thought about the crack in the northeast footing and the depression in the ground at the southeast corner. She thought about the padlock on the hatch that she did not have a key for, and about the fact that no one at the county assessor's office had mentioned a key, which might mean there was no key to mention or might mean something else. She thought about the word condemned. Condemned meant the county had looked at the tower and decided it was beyond their interest to maintain or restore. It did not mean, she told herself, that the tower was necessarily beyond her interest to understand. Those were different conclusions drawn from different priorities. By the time she reached Creel Street, the children were already home. Her daughter was in the kitchen starting dinner without being asked, which she did sometimes, and which always made Miriam feel a complex and layered emotion she had not yet found the right word for. Her son was at the table drawing something with great concentration, a vehicle of some kind, from the angle she could tell, something with large wheels and a cab. She hung her coat, still wearing the work gloves, and her daughter looked at them. "Where were you?" her daughter asked. Looking at something," Miriam said. Her daughter studied her in the way that 14-year-olds study their parents when they sense information is being withheld. Miriam set the tin box on the counter. "What is that?" her daughter asked. "I don't know yet," Miriam said. They ate dinner. She put the children to bed. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of her, and a butter knife she intended to use as a prying tool if the lid resisted, which she was confident it would. It did. The rust had essentially fused the seam. She worked around the edge with the knife blade, applying steady pressure, not forcing, understanding that old sealed things punish impatience and reward consistency. After 20 minutes, the lid gave a sound like a small intake of breath and lifted. Inside was a folded square of oilcloth, the kind used to protect things from moisture, stained brown at its edges but intact. She unfolded it on the table, carefully smoothing the creases. Inside the oilcloth was a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, and beneath that, a small iron key with a square head, heavy for its size. The paper was yellowed and fragile at its fold lines. She opened it with the same patience she had applied to the box, easing the quadrants apart rather than pulling them. The writing inside was in faded pencil, the hand not elegant but deliberate, the writing of someone who was not accustomed to writing much, but had wanted to be understood. The note said 4 things. The first was a date, decades old. The second was a reference to the tower, not by address but by description, the one on Harmon, with the bad leg, in a way that suggested the writer had known it well. The third was a phrase that she read 3 times before she was sure she was reading it correctly. It said, "What is in the floor is not the county's and never was." The fourth was a name she did not recognize. She set the paper down and looked at the key. The square head of it was distinctive. She picked it up and turned it in the kitchen light. It was not corroded the way the box itself had been. The oilcloth had done its work. The key had been preserved with intention. She thought about the padlock on the hatch. She set the key on top of the folded note and placed both of them carefully to one side of the tin box. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the street with a sound like breath being released. She thought about what it meant that the box had been placed against the footing rather than inside the structure. She thought about who would have known to place it there, and when, and why they had not returned to retrieve it or act on whatever the note was pointing toward. She thought about the phrase, "What is in the floor is not the county's." The floor of the tank. She had not been inside the tank. She had not been able to open the hatch. She held the key in her palm again, and this time its weight felt different, less like an object and more like a specific kind of answer to a specific kind of question. She did not go back to the tower that night. Then the hour was wrong, and the instinct that had served her reliably through years of hard circumstances told her that some things required daylight and preparation, not urgency. She would go back. She would bring the key. She would find out whether it fit. But first she needed to think about what the note had said, and what the floor of a forgotten water tower on Harmon Road might conceivably contain, and why someone had gone to the trouble of sealing that information in oilcloth and hiding it against a footing where the casual visitor would not have looked. She thought about all of it until well past midnight. Then she folded the note back into its quadrants, wrapped the key in the oilcloth, and set the tin box in the back of her closet behind the winter coats where the children would not encounter it by accident. And she slept better than she expected. She went to the tower 4 days later. The delay was not hesitation, it was logistics. The janitorial shifts she could not miss, the school schedules she had organized around, the errand on Thursday that could not be rescheduled. When she finally returned to Harmon Road on a weekday morning when both children were in school and her next shift did not begin until 3 in the afternoon, she brought the key, a better flashlight than the one she had used on her first visit, the work gloves, and a thermos of coffee that she drank half of while sitting in the car before she got out. The tower received her with the same indifference as before. The iron did not acknowledge ownership. The grass at the base was the same compressed gray it had been the week before. As she walked to the base of the ladder without stopping to look around this time, more purposeful than she had allowed herself to feel on the first visit, she climbed. The platform at the top was steady beneath her boots. its iron surface granular with rust, but solid. The wind was stronger today than it had been before, pushing at her from the southwest, carrying the smell of cold and distance. She braced herself against the leg of the tank and looked at the hatch. The manufacturer's locking mechanism was a lever-style bar bolted through a hasp. It had not been engaged. She could see now that she was looking for it specifically. The bar was pinned in its open position, which meant the tank had not been sealed by its own hardware. Only the padlock, the newer one, had been locking it. She took out the key and examined the padlock in the daylight. Square-headed key, round-bodied lock. She inserted the key. It fit exactly and without resistance, as if it had been made for this moment rather than having waited through decades of weather and obscurity. The lock opened. She removed it from the hasp and hooked it over a rung of the ladder where it would not fall. Then she gripped the hatch handle, which was a simple iron ring welded to the door, and pulled. The hatch was heavy and its hinges had stiffened in the years since anyone had opened it, but it came, slowly, grinding against its own accumulated resistance until it was open at 90 degrees and held there by its own weight against the side of the tank. Cold air rose from below. She switched on the flashlight and angled it downward into the opening. The inside of the tank was larger than it appeared from the outside, or perhaps it was the acoustics that created that impression, the way the flashlight beam expanded as it reached the curved interior walls. The tank had been drained long ago, of course. The decommissioning would have ensured that. The interior surface was coated in what remained of a dark protective sealant, flaking in places, still adhering in others. The walls curved upward and then outward in the tank's distinctive rounded shape. The air smelled of metal and dryness and a particular kind of age that belongs to enclosed spaces. The floor was perhaps 20 feet below the hatch. She could not see it clearly from this angle. She would need to go down. She tested the interior ladder, which ran from the hatch opening down the curved wall to the floor. The rungs were iron and fixed directly to the wall. The first rung she tested held without shifting. She continued testing each one as she descended, her flashlight clamped in her teeth, one hand on the rung above at all times. The interior of the tank was quieter than the outside. The wind that had pressed against her on the platform was gone. The sound of the world above diminished with each rung until by the time her boots touched the floor, all she could hear was her own breathing and the faint metallic resonance of the structure itself. She shone the flashlight across the floor. It was not the floor she had expected. She had expected a flat iron plate, perhaps rusted, perhaps cracked, the simple industrial bottom of a functional tank. What she found instead was something that did not immediately resolve into meaning. And the floor was iron, yes. And it was flat, but it was not continuous. There was a seam, a visible, deliberate seam that ran across the floor in a shape that she had to move the flashlight beam slowly to fully trace. It was a rectangle, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, set into the floor with edges that had been fitted rather than welded. Not a gap or a crack, a frame, an intentional border around a section of the floor that was distinct from the rest. She crouched, her knees pressing into the cold iron. She ran her gloved fingers along the seam. The fit was close, the tolerances tight, but her fingernail, even through the glove, found the edge of it without difficulty. Whatever this section of the floor was, it had been designed to be removable. She moved the flashlight slowly across the rectangle's surface. In the center, barely visible beneath a film of dark residue, was a fitting. Not a handle, exactly, but a recessed iron pull, circular, set flush with the floor, so that it would not protrude and would not be obvious to someone who was not looking for it. She was looking for it. Her hand hovered over the pull for a moment, not from doubt, from the particular quality of attention that arrives just before a thing that cannot be undone. She thought about the note. What is in the floor is not the county's, and never was. She thought about the key, and the oilcloth, and the name she did not recognize. She thought about $8, and the flyer on the kitchen table, and her daughter reading county notices in the same way she read everything, with full and uncautious attention. She gripped the pull. It resisted at first. See the way things resist when they have not been moved in a long time and need to be reminded that they were built to move. She applied steady pressure without forcing, turning the pull slightly, feeling for the mechanism beneath it. There was a click, felt more than heard. Then the resistance changed character, becoming not the resistance of something stuck, but the resistance of something heavy. She pulled. The floor section rose. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested, and she understood as she lifted it with both hands and the muscles in her arms and shoulders engaged fully, that the weight was not incidental. Whatever she was holding had been built with weight as a feature, not a flaw. Thick iron, reinforced edges. This was not the top of an empty space, and this was the door of something designed to protect its contents against time, against pressure, against the patience of anyone who might have otherwise gotten in. She set the heavy plate to one side, carefully, not allowing it to drop against the tank floor where the noise would have said everything. She picked up the flashlight. She looked down. The space beneath the floor was not large, perhaps 3 feet deep, perhaps 5 feet across, lined on 3 sides with iron walls that had been fitted and bolted from the inside, not welded, fitted, in the way that things are fitted when they are meant to be serviced rather than sealed forever. The bottom of the space was smooth and dry. The air that rose from it was the same cool, close air as the tank above, but older feeling, more still, as if this space had been breathing less frequently for longer. What was in the space was not immediately identifiable. Her flashlight beam moved across rows of objects arranged with deliberate care. They were rectangular, uniform in size, stacked in 2 layers, wrapped in a material that had darkened with age, but not decayed. She counted them without deciding to count, the way a person does arithmetic without meaning to when faced with a visual pattern. 12, 16, more. She moved the beam more slowly. They were stacked in rows of 4, 3 rows deep on each side of the space, 2 layers high. The wrapping on the nearest stack had pulled away at one corner, whether from age or from some long-ago settling of the structure she could not know. Through the gap, the wrapping left, and she saw a surface that caught her flashlight beam and held it in a way that iron does not, and that most metals do not, but that one particular metal does with a consistency that defies both time and obscurity. Yellow. Deep and warm and absolutely unmistakable. She sat back on her heels. She did not make a sound. Outside, the wind moved against the tank's round exterior, and the iron hummed faintly, the way iron hums when it has been standing in one place for a very long time and has grown accustomed to bearing whatever the world places on it. She sat on the floor of a condemned water tower on Harmon Road, in a county the state had mostly forgotten, and looked at a row of gold bars stacked in a vault beneath the floor, and she breathed very slowly and very carefully, and she did not yet allow herself to think about what any of it meant. She only looked. And for the first time in a very long time, what she was looking at did not ask her to move faster than she was able to. It simply waited. The way things wait when they have already been waiting for a very long time and have learned the particular patience of the hidden. She stayed in the tank for a long time without moving. This is the thing that is difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it, the way that an enormous thing, when it finally arrives, does not feel enormous immediately. It feels unreal first. It feels like a mistake, like the mind catching up slowly to what the eyes have already confirmed. She had expected, in some abstract and uncalculated way, that discovery would feel like speed, like rushing forward, like something unlocking all at once. Instead, it felt like stillness, like standing on ground that had shifted beneath her feet and waiting for the world to decide whether it would tilt further or settle. The flashlight beam rested on the gap in the wrapping, on that exposed corner of yellow that caught the light and gave it back warm and unhurried, as though it had been prepared for exactly this moment and saw no reason to perform. She breathed. In. Out. Her breath made no fog in the air, here the way it had outside. The vault space was not warm, but it was sheltered from the cold in a way that the iron tower above it was not. The thick walls of the fitted chamber had been doing their work for years, insulating the space not from temperature alone, but from everything: moisture, sound, intrusion, time. She did not reach in immediately. She set the flashlight on the floor of the tank beside the open hatch plate, angling it so that its beam fell across the vault at a low angle, illuminating the contents with a steadier light than she could produce by hand. Then she looked at what the light revealed. The bars were stacked in rows of 4, 3 rows per layer, 2 layers deep on each side of the central access space. She counted more carefully now that the panic of the first sight had subsided into something more functional. 24 on the left, 24 on the right. She went back and counted again. The same. 48 individual bars, most still wrapped in their darkened material, a few at the near edge where age or slight settling had loosened the coverings and allowed the metal beneath to show itself. She had no frame of reference for the weight of a gold bar. She had no framework that made 48 of them a sensible number. She only knew what she could see, which was that the space had been built specifically for these objects, that the objects had been placed with care, that the care had lasted decades, and that whoever had built this and whoever had placed these things here had understood that they were hiding something worth hiding. She reached into the vault and, with both gloved hands, lifted one of the exposed bars from the top layer on the right side. The weight was immediate and startling. Not dangerous, not unmanageable, but completely out of proportion with the bar's size, which was roughly that of a thick, hardcover book. The density of it communicated itself directly through her palms and wrists and up into her forearms. She had lifted heavy things her entire working life. And this was a different kind of heavy, intentional, concentrated, the weight of something that had been compressed into as small a form as possible without ceasing to be itself. She brought the bar up into the tank proper and set it on the floor beside the flashlight. She removed her glove from her right hand and touched the exposed corner of the surface. It was cold, the cold of the vault. But beneath that, a faint warmth asserted itself in the way that dense metals hold the ambient temperature of whatever has been closest to them longest. It was not the brittle cold of iron. It was something richer, something that would warm quickly in held hands. She looked at the surface in the flashlight beam. The color was not the bright, declarative yellow of jewelry or of the word gold when it appears in headlines. It was deeper than that, more serious. A yellow that carries within itself the specific gravity of what it is, a color that does not perform, but simply exists with the confidence of something that has never needed to prove itself. She did not cry. She had half expected to, in the distant and theoretical way one imagines one might react to something completely beyond experience. But what she felt was not the kind of feeling that resolves itself in crying. It was quieter than that, more interior, more structural, as if something in the framework of how she understood her own life was in the process of being quietly and permanently rearranged. She replaced the bar in the vault exactly where it had been, in the position and orientation she had found it. She replaced the wrapping over the exposed corner as carefully as its age would allow. She lowered the floor plate back into position, working slowly, aligning the edges before allowing the weight to settle. The locking mechanism engaged with the same click she had felt when she opened it. She covered the pull with her gloved thumb until she felt the fit seat fully. Then she climbed out of the tank, closed the hatch, replaced the padlock, and climbed down the exterior ladder to the ground. She stood at the base of the tower for a long moment, with both hands resting against one of the legs. The iron was cold through her gloves. The sky above her was the flat, pale color of late morning in autumn, neither threatening nor generous, simply present. Harmon Road was empty in both directions. No cars, no movement. The land beyond the property line continued its own quiet work of existing, indifferent to what had just occurred 6 stories above it in the belly of a condemned structure that the county had sold for $8 to a woman who cleaned offices at night. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the engine off. She placed her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way she always drove, the habit of a careful person. She looked at the tower through the windshield. The note had said, "What is in the floor is not the county's and never was." She thought about that sentence now with a specificity she had not been able to apply to it before. Not the county's. Which meant it was someone else's. Which meant there was a history to this, a chain of possession and intention that did not begin with her and had not, apparently, ended with whoever had placed it there. Because the county had not known what it was selling. The assessor's office had processed the transaction in the same mechanical way they processed every other surplus listing, without inventory, without inspection, without curiosity about what a condemned water tower on Harmon Road might be holding in a vault beneath its floor. $8. She started the car and drove home. In the days that followed, she was careful in the specific and practical way that she was careful about everything that mattered. She did not go back to the tower immediately. She did not change her behavior in any way that would be visible to the people who watched her. And in a small county, people watched. Not with malice always, but with the sustained attention that comes from living close together and having long memories. She worked her shifts. She drove her children to school. She bought groceries at the East Side store. She paid the rent on the Creel Street house on the first of the month, as she always did, with a specific combination of denominations that suggested she had counted and recounted what she was handing over before it left her hands. Inside that ordinary exterior, she was thinking with a focus and intensity she had rarely been able to apply to anything except keeping her family stable. She was thinking about gold, about the nature of it, the history of it, the legal character of it, about what it meant to find something and what finding it actually entitled you to. She was not naive. She understood that discovery was not the same as ownership. thought that the existence of the note and the key did not automatically resolve the question of who the bars belonged to or what she was permitted to do about them. She understood that making a mistake here, moving too fast or too visibly or without the right information, could transform the discovery from an asset into a liability in a way that would leave her worse off than she had begun. So she was careful, and she was methodical, and she thought before she did anything at all. She began at the library, not the library in her house. She did not have one, but the public library on 5th Street, where she went in the early morning on days when her shifts did not start until afternoon. She read what she could find on the subject of found property, on buried treasure law, and on the specific legal frameworks that governed the discovery of valuable objects in structures owned outright rather than rented or occupied under any other arrangement. The reading was dense and not always clear and sometimes contradicted itself, but patterns emerged. Property that is discovered within land or a structure that is owned outright by the finder is treated differently in most jurisdictions than property found in a public space or on land belonging to another party. The distinction between abandoned property and mislaid property matters legally. Abandoned suggests that the original owner relinquished all claim, while mislaid suggests that the owner intended to return. The distinction is not always easy to determine and is sometimes contested. She read about cases. There were not many that were directly comparable, and because most cases involving substantial fines of this kind had very specific local contexts that changed their legal character. But the consistent thread in the cases she found was this: documentation mattered. The record of how a thing was found, when, by whom, and under what circumstances was not incidental to the legal outcome. It was central. She began keeping notes. She also began researching the tower's history, which proved more complicated than she expected. County records were incomplete in the way that county records are when nobody has had a reason to look at them in 30 years. What she could establish was that the tower had been built in the early part of the previous century, commissioned by a water company that no longer existed under that name. The company had changed hands multiple times over the decades, each transfer generating paperwork that was archived with varying degrees of care. What she could not immediately establish was who had built the vault beneath the floor, and when, and for what purpose. The tower itself was in the record. The vault was not. On her third visit to the library, looking through microfilmed copies of local newspaper archives, she found something. A small notice in an edition from several decades back, not a headline story, but a brief item in the community section, the kind of short paragraph that appears between a church supper announcement and a notice about road closures. It mentioned the name on the note, the one she had found in the tin box. It connected that name to a business, not a water company, something else entirely. An enterprise that dealt in metals, in importation, and in the quiet movement of valuable commodities during a period when such movement was subject to restrictions that no longer existed but had once been enforced with considerable seriousness. She sat with the microfilm reader for a long time after that, the green-tinted image of the page filling the screen in front of her. The librarian moved in the background, reshuffling a cart of returns. A child at a table nearby was doing homework with the particular concentration of someone trying very hard not to ask for help. She understood now, or believed she understood, something about the vault's origins. Someone had built it during a period when holding wealth in certain forms was both legally complex and practically dangerous. the tank of a decommissioned water tower, or perhaps at the time of building. In a water tower that was still in some degree of use, its industrial character providing cover, had offered something valuable: height, isolation, legal invisibility, and the structural integrity to hold considerable weight without attracting curiosity. The vault had not been built hastily or cheaply. It had been built by someone who understood construction and who intended the contents to remain safe for a long time. What had prevented the return? She could speculate. The newspaper notices and the available records, sparse as they were, suggested that the individual named had ceased to be a presence in the county sometime after the tower had been decommissioned. No obituary she could find, no forwarding address in any document she could access, simply an absence that began at a certain point and did not end. And the tin box with the key and the note. She thought about who had placed it there, whether it had been the same person who built the vault or someone who came after, someone who had known the secret and had tried, in the particular way of people who are not sure they will have another chance, to leave a trail for whoever came next. What she could not know was how many people had walked past that northeast footing over the years without crouching down into the compressed grass to look. How many assessors, how many town workers, how many curious children or trespassing teenagers had passed through or around that property without finding the tin box that she had found on her first visit, because she was the kind of person who looked at the ground as carefully as she looked at the structure above it. She thought about luck, and then decided that luck was not quite the right word. She went back to the tower on a morning that was cold enough to require the heavier of her two work coats. She brought the flashlight, the gloves, a notebook, and a camera, an old one, simple, purchased second-hand years ago for the children's school events and rarely used since. She climbed the ladder with the ease of familiarity now, the rungs no longer requiring individual assessment, her body having learned the rhythm of the ascent. Inside the tank, she worked methodically. She photographed the floor before she opened the hatch plate, then the plate itself from above, then the vault interior from the edge of the opening, then each row of bars from as many angles as the space would allow. She wrote down her count. 48. And she measured the vault space using the span of her hand as a reference, noting the dimensions in her notebook. She made note of the construction details, the bolted rather than welded walls, the fitted rather than cast iron of the hatch plate itself, the particular style of the locking mechanism, which she would later learn was consistent with a type of hardware commonly used in commercial storage applications during a specific historical period. She lifted one bar again and photographed it in her hand with the flashlight angled across it, the deep yellow of the surface catching the light in a way the camera captured imperfectly but adequately. She turned it over. On the underside, near one end, was a marking she had not noticed on her first examination. A stamped impression, not words but a symbol, a hallmark of the kind used by refiners and assayers to identify the origin and purity of a piece. She photographed the hallmark from as close as she could manage. She replaced everything as she had found it. She locked the hatch. She climbed down. On the drive home, she stopped at the East Side grocery store and bought milk and bread and a bar of chocolate that she split 3 ways with the children that evening without explaining why. Her son asked if something good had happened. She told him she had had a productive morning. He accepted this without suspicion. Her daughter looked at her with those observant 14-year-old eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of knowledge. The next step required someone she could trust. This was not a simple requirement. Trust of the kind she needed. quiet, discreet, professionally competent, not prone to speaking before they understood the consequences of speaking, was not abundant in anyone's life, and in hers it was rationed by necessity. She had kept her own counsel for years because counsel required reciprocity, and she had not always had enough surplus to offer. She thought carefully about who she knew. There was a woman she had worked beside at the processing plant for 3 years. They were not close in the way that people who spend a great deal of time together sometimes become close, but there was a quality to their acquaintance that Miriam valued, a mutual recognition of the other as capable, serious, and not given to drama. The woman's husband worked in appraisal, not gold specifically, not rare metals, but valuables of various kinds, estates, collections, the sort of work that required familiarity with authentication and the habit of discretion that professional appraisal demands. Miriam approached her at work on a Friday, at the end of a shift, in the parking lot where conversations could be had without an audience. She did not explain everything. She explained enough. She had found something in a property she owned and needed to know what it was worth and who might authenticate it properly. She asked whether the woman's husband would be willing to have a conversation in confidence. She used the word confidence twice so that it registered. The woman looked at her steadily for a moment, the way she looked at everything without hurry. "What kind of something?" she asked. Miriam showed her the photograph of the bar in her hand, just the one photograph. As she watched the woman's expression and saw the sequence she had half expected, recognition, surprise, and then the careful closing down of the expression into something neutral and private. "I'll ask him," the woman said. He came to the tower 2 days later. Miriam had arranged the meeting for a Monday morning, midweek enough that Harmon Road would be as quiet as it ever was. His name was Gerald, a man of about 50, compact and precise in his movements, who carried a small leather case and wore a jacket that had the specific drape of someone who wore it to work rather than to impress. He said very little on the walk from the car to the base of the tower. He looked at the structure without commenting on its appearance. They climbed the ladder without discussion. Inside the tank, Miriam opened the hatch and stood aside. Gerald crouched at the edge of the vault opening and looked in for a long time without reaching for anything. He took a small flashlight from his jacket pocket, a brighter and more targeted beam than hers, and moved it across the contents with slow precision. He reached in and, as she had done, lifted a bar from the top layer. He turned it in the beam of his own light, his face close to the surface. He removed something from his case, a small lens, and examined the hallmark with it for a long time. He set the bar on the floor of the tank and lifted a second one from a different position in the vault. He examined it. He lifted a third from the lower layer. He set it beside the others. Then he sat back and was quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the tank with its low, constant hum. Miriam did not speak, as she had understood from the beginning that this moment required patience, and she was prepared to supply as much of it as was needed. The hallmarks are consistent with a refinery that operated during the mid-20th century, Gerald said at last, his voice even. 2 of them carried dual stamps, which would suggest authentication by a second party, common in certain commercial contexts of that period. He paused. The specific stamps I'm seeing are associated with a small number of high-purity refineries, 99.5% or better. Miriam said nothing. "I would need laboratory confirmation," he said. "What I can tell you from examination is that the visual and physical characteristics are consistent with genuine, high-purity gold bullion of that period. The weight is consistent. The hallmarks are of the correct style and format. The surface characteristics under magnification are what I would expect. He looked at her. I cannot give you a number in this room, but I can tell you that what I am looking at is not consistent with any kind of forgery I have encountered or heard of. He returned the 3 bars to their positions in the vault. He closed the hatch. He replaced his flashlight in his jacket. How many? He asked. 48, Miriam said. He was quiet again. She could see him doing arithmetic in a way that did not show on his face, but was visible in a slight stillness around his eyes. I'll put you in contact with someone who can do the formal assessment, he said. A friend, trustworthy in the way you need. He paused. This is not the kind of thing that benefits from speed. I know, Miriam said. And it's not the kind of thing that benefits from width, he said. Meaning, the fewer people who knew, the better. Meaning, what had been said here should not compound itself without her deliberate consent. I know that too, she said. They climbed down the ladder in silence. In the parking area beside her car, Gerald shook her hand, which he had not done when they met. The handshake was brief, but its weight was different from a social greeting. It was the handshake of someone who had looked at something significant and was acknowledging its significance without making it into performance. He drove away. She stood for a moment beside her car in the cold, looking at the tower. 48 bars of high-purity gold. She had read enough now to know approximately what the weight of each bar would be if it conformed to standard commercial specifications of the period Gerald had identified. She had read enough to know what gold of that purity commanded on authenticated sale. The numbers were not precise. They could not be precise without the laboratory confirmation Gerald had mentioned. But even at the lower end of any reasonable estimation, the figure was not something she had ever assembled in her mind before, not in relation to herself, not in relation to anything she had ever owned or touched or been responsible for. $300 million was a number that existed, in her experience, in the same category as astronomical distances and geological time. It was a real number, but it was not a human number. It was a number that existed in reports and in the ledgers of institutions, not in the lives of people who drove 40 miles to work conveyor lines on weekends. She drove to school pickup. Her son climbed into the car and announced, with the total conviction of an 11-year-old, that he had been very unfairly treated in gym class that day. She listened carefully and asked questions, and did not think about gold for the duration of the drive home, which was something she had to actively work at but managed. Her daughter got into the car at the high school pickup and looked at her in that particular way. You look different, her daughter said. Do I? Miriam said. Yes, her daughter said. You look like you're deciding something. Miriam glanced at her in the rearview mirror. I'm always deciding something, she said. She heard daughter turn to look out the window. This is a bigger something, she said. Miriam did not answer. The road continued under the tires, familiar and ordinary, the same road she had driven hundreds of times, carrying the same cargo of the life she had built carefully and imperfectly in a county the state had mostly forgotten. The formal assessment came 3 weeks later. Gerald had arranged for a colleague, a woman who worked in precious metals authentication for a firm based in the city, whose discretion he had vouched for personally, to conduct a proper examination of the bars. This required transporting a sample, which required paperwork, which required that Miriam consult, at Gerald's strong recommendation, with a lawyer before anything else moved. and the lawyer was a man in his late 60s who occupied a small office above a dry cleaning business on the county's main commercial street. Gerald had described him as someone who had seen unusual situations and understood that unusual situations required unusual patience. He charged a consultation fee that was less than she expected, but still significant in her budget, and she paid it with the same counted care with which she paid everything. She sat across from him at a desk covered in a working layer of documents and explained the situation from the beginning. She showed him the note, the photograph of the key, the photograph she had taken in the vault. She showed him the receipt for the property purchase, $8, stamped and dated, signed by the county assessor's clerk. He listened without interrupting. He read the note twice. He looked at the photographs with the same unhurried attention Gerald had brought to the vault itself. "The property is unambiguously yours," he said when she had finished. "The county divested all interest in it at the point of sale. The sale was documented and legal." He set the photographs down. "The question of what belongs to you within that property is more nuanced. There is no relevant claim on file from any party. What you have described is consistent with property that has been abandoned, legally abandoned, which means the original owner or their heirs have either failed to assert a claim or cannot do so." "Is anyone looking for it?" she asked. "I will find out," he said. He spent 2 weeks finding out. What he found was nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The name from the note, the business associated with it, the estate filings that might have listed assets, none of it produced a surviving claimant. The original holders of the vault's contents had left no legal trail that pointed forward to any living person with standing to assert ownership. The property had moved through the county's surplus system without generating any inquiry. No estate claim had ever been filed that mentioned the tower or the contents within it. "In my assessment," the lawyer said, during their second meeting in the same small office, "what you have found constitutes abandoned property discovered within land you own outright. The legal pathway is not without process. There will be filings. There will be a waiting period. There will be due diligence conducted by the relevant authorities. But I see no obstacle that is insurmountable." He paused. "You will need to be patient, and you will need to remain very quiet." Miriam told him she was good at both. The authentication, when it came, was conducted in a climate-controlled room in the city, in a building that bore no external sign of what went on inside it. Gerald's colleague, the authenticator, a careful and self-contained woman who wore her hair back and carried herself with the confidence of someone who was very good at something few people understood, worked on 12 of the bars, drawn from different positions in the vault, and transported under documentation that the lawyer had arranged with a precision that surprised Miriam until she understood that this was simply what competence looked like when applied without hurry. The laboratory work took 4 days. The report arrived on a Thursday morning in an envelope the lawyer brought to a meeting he had called specifically for its receipt. He handed it across the desk. She opened it. She read the relevant sections, which were not long but were dense with specific language about purity percentages, assay methodology, and comparative analysis with records of refiners from the identified period. 99.7% purity. Average weight per bar, approximately 400 troy ounces, 48 bars. She did the arithmetic slowly, with a deliberateness that honored the size of the number. 48 bars at 400 troy ounces each, 19,200 troy ounces total. At current gold prices, which the lawyer's assistant had noted in the margin in pencil, then having run the calculation that morning, The total valuation fell between $290 million and $320 million, depending on the method of sale and applicable market conditions at the time of transaction. She set the report down. The lawyer watched her. $308 million, she said. She was approximating to the center of the range. The number felt on her tongue like a word from a language she had studied but never spoken. Approximately, he said. She looked at the report again. The precision of its language, the institutional weight of its conclusions, the specific and irreversible nature of what it confirmed. All of it was real. Not a mistake. Not a provisional assessment. Real. She thought about the $8. She thought about the clerk who had slid the receipt across the counter and said, "You know it's condemned." She thought about the neighbor who had come to her door to warn her about the legs, about the supervisor at the janitorial company who had explained to her, in the tone people use when they are delivering bad news they find slightly enjoyable to deliver, that she was throwing good money after bad. About the man on the sidewalk who had used the word liability 4 times and shaken his head in the way that communicated loss without requiring the speaker to express it directly. She folded the authentication report and placed it in the envelope. "What happens next?" she asked. The lawyer told her. The process would take time. There were filings to make, a formal claim period during which any surviving interested party could come forward, a financial and legal structures to establish before anything moved. There would be valuators and tax advisors and several more meetings in several more offices. The gold would remain in the vault, secured now with better documentation and a chain of custody the lawyer had already begun establishing, until the legal process had completed itself. "And if someone comes forward," she said, "during the claim period?" "Anyone who comes forward will need standing," he said. "Standing requires provable connection to the original owner. Given what we have found in the records, that seems unlikely. But it is possible. Nothing is impossible." He looked at her steadily. "If it happens, we deal with it. We have the documentation, we have the purchase record, we have your established possession of the property. We are not without resources." She nodded. She drove home from the city in the late afternoon light that comes in November at a low angle and turns ordinary things golden, which she noticed and did not remark on to herself, because she was not the kind of person who made easy metaphors from the world's coincidences. On Harmon Road, she slowed without fully stopping, the tower passing the window on her left. It looked the same from the road as it had always looked. Rusted, tired, leaning slightly into its own long history. The kind of structure that draws the eye only long enough to register and dismiss, and then is forgotten before the next curve in the road. She drove on. That evening, after dinner, after the dishes, and after her son's homework and her daughter's reading and the small domestic adjustments that constituted the end of a day in the Creel Street house, she sat in the kitchen in the quiet that followed the children going to bed, and she held in her hands the thing that she had been carrying for weeks now without being able to set it down. Not the gold. She was not thinking about the gold in the abstract sense that the number demanded. She was thinking about something smaller, more specific, more hers. She was thinking about the morning she had stood in the dark kitchen with the refrigerator open and picked up the county flyer, about the way her daughter had left it on the table, about the particular quality of attention that her daughter had brought to everything around her since she was very small, and an attention that noticed details others passed by, that read county notices when other 14-year-olds read other things, that looked at her mother across a car and said, This is a bigger something. She thought about what it meant to have made a decision that everyone around her had understood as foolish, and to have been correct. Not because correctness was a victory over those who had doubted. She was not interested in that kind of accounting. But because being correct, in this case, meant that her children would not grow up in the way she had grown up, in the way she had been raising them so far, with money that moved through cupped hands and left nothing behind. The authentication report was in the envelope in the back of her closet behind the winter coats, beside the tin box. $308 million. As she turned off the kitchen light, she went to bed. In the morning, she drove to the janitorial company's dispatch office and collected her assignment for the day and cleaned 3 floors of office space in a building downtown, working with the same careful competence she brought to every task, leaving each surface as she found it, and better. The secret held because she held it. The tower stood on Harmon Road because towers stand until they are moved. The gold remained in the vault beneath the tank floor because it had been placed with the intention that it would remain by someone who had not returned and had been rediscovered by someone who understood, with the specific understanding of a person who has had to be careful about everything, exactly what moved too fast and too visibly tends to cost. She was not in a hurry. She had learned long ago that the things most worth having were the things that rewarded patience. She had learned it in the hard and unglamorous way, through years of practicing it without reward. She understood now that the practice had not been wasted. It had simply been preparation for a moment she could not have anticipated, arrived at through a door that no one else in the county had thought to open because no one else in the county had crouched down in the cold, compressed grass at the base of a northeast footing and looked at the ground the way she looked at everything. The county assessor's clerk had been right. The tower was condemned. But condemnation, Miriam had discovered, was a judgment made by people who had not looked closely enough. She had looked closely. The legal claim period lasted 90 days. That the lawyer had explained this at the outset, calmly and without embellishment, the way he explained everything, as a fact to be managed rather than an obstacle to be feared. 90 days during which any party with a legitimate interest in the contents of the vault could come forward and present their standing. After that, if no credible claim had been filed, the process of establishing her legal ownership of the bars would proceed through the remaining steps, which were bureaucratic rather than contentious, slow rather than dramatic, the kind of thing that required patience above all else. She was good at patience. She had been practicing it, without knowing it was preparation, for a very long time. She did not tell her children for the first 30 days. This was not deception. It was the same instinct that had guided her through every difficult situation she had navigated alone. The understanding that information shared too early, before its shape was clear, before the outcome was sufficiently probable, only transferred anxiety without transferring anything useful. Her children had carried enough ambient anxiety over the years. She would not add to it until she had something solid to hand them alongside the news. So she continued. The shifts at the janitorial company, the weekend drives to the processing plant, the school pickups and the homework supervision, and the careful management of a household budget that had not changed yet, though she understood now that it would. See, she lived inside the ordinary dimensions of her life, with an awareness of what lay beneath them that she carried the way she imagined a person carries a compass, not visible to anyone else, not dramatic in any way, but constantly orienting. On the 31st day, she told her daughter, She chose a Sunday evening after her son had gone to sleep at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and 2 cups of tea made from the same bag because they had learned long ago to be economical about tea bags without discussing it. Her daughter sat across from her with the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting for something without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. Miriam set the authentication report on the table. She set the photograph of the bar in her hand beside it. She did not explain everything at once. She gave it to her daughter the way you give heavy things to someone you trust. Not all at once, but with attention to whether they are ready for the next piece before it arrives. Her daughter read slowly. She was a careful reader, always had been, the kind who went back rather than forward when something needed to settle. When she set the report down, she looked at the photograph for a long time. "This is from the tower," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Miriam said. Her daughter looked at her, 14 years old, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a child receiving extraordinary news. It was the expression of someone whose understanding of the world was being quietly and permanently revised and who was taking the revision seriously. "Are we going to be okay?" her daughter asked. "Not are we going to be rich. Not is this real. Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," Miriam said. "We are going to be more than okay." Her daughter picked up her tea. She drank from it slowly. Then she put the cup down and said, "I knew it was a bigger something." Miriam looked at her daughter's face in the kitchen light and felt something move through her that had no name in the vocabulary she had been using for years. It was not relief exactly, and it was not joy exactly, and it was not pride exactly. It was all of those things layered into something that did not resolve into a single word, because single words were not built for it. They sat at the table for another hour, not always talking, sometimes simply existing together in the particular quiet of a shared knowledge that has not yet been spoken to the world. When Miriam finally told her son, she did it differently. And he was 11, and the world was still something he approached with the full confidence of someone who had not yet been comprehensively disappointed by it. She told him in the car on the way home from his Saturday morning activity, choosing the moving car deliberately. It was easier, she had always found, to say difficult or large things when you could both look forward rather than at each other. She told him about the tower first, about the ladder and the hatch, about the vault beneath the floor. She watched his face in the rearview mirror as the story assembled itself in his understanding, his expression moving through confusion into concentration, into something that she recognized as the beginning of wonder. When she told him the number, he was quiet for a moment. 308 million, he said. Approximately, she said. And he was quiet again for the length of 2 blocks. Mom, he said. Yes, she said. Is that enough to get the thing fixed on the car? She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place so far beneath performance that it cannot be manufactured. The laugh lasted longer than the moment warranted, and she did not apologize for it. Yes, she said. That is enough to get the thing fixed on the car. The secret, which had been so carefully contained, began to breathe on the 45th day. Not because Miriam spoke. She did not speak. It began in the way that significant things in small counties always begin, not with a disclosure, but with an accumulation of details too small individually to mean anything, but too consistent collectively to be ignored. Gerald's colleague had required a van and 2 colleagues to transport the sample bars to the city for authentication. The van had been parked on Harmon Road for 2 hours, Someone had noticed. Someone always noticed in a county where Harmon Road saw, on a normal day, perhaps a dozen vehicles. A van with city plates, parked outside a condemned water tower that had recently changed hands for $8, produced a particular quality of curiosity in people who had the time and inclination to follow curiosity wherever it pointed. The lawyer had also made filings. Filings were public record. They were not descriptive. The language was deliberately dry and technically impenetrable to anyone without specific legal training, but they were there. Connected to the property on Harmon Road. Connected to her name. Someone asked someone. Someone else connected the van to the filings. A version of events assembled itself that was mostly incorrect in its details but directionally accurate in its conclusion, that something had been found in the water tower and that the woman who had bought it for $8 might not have made the foolish decision everyone had assumed. The conversations changed. They changed in the specific and telling way that conversations change in communities where an outsider opinion has been formed about a person and that opinion has been discovered to be wrong. The change was not swift or clean. It moved the way a tide moves, gradually, the surface looking the same, while the pressure beneath it shifted in a direction that would eventually become impossible to ignore. And the neighbor who had come to her door to warn her about the legs stopped her on the sidewalk now with a different expression. Not concern this time. Something more careful than concern. Something that had done reconnaissance before presenting itself. She asked Miriam, with the specific casualness of a question that had been rehearsed, whether anything had come of the tower. Miriam told her the process was ongoing. The neighbor nodded with a gravity that suggested she had expected as much, which she had not. The supervisor at the janitorial company pulled her aside again, this time not to explain liability to her, this time to say in a tone that was a full instrument lower than the one he had used the first time, that he had heard some things, that he wanted her to know that if there was anything she needed, schedule flexibility, and a reference for anything, she should let him know. She thanked him with the same measured courtesy with which she thanked everyone and returned to her work. The man from the sidewalk did not stop her again. She saw him once from across the street, and when their eyes met, he nodded once, quickly, with the nod of a person who has recently discovered the specific discomfort of being on the wrong side of a judgment they delivered confidently and publicly. She nodded back because she was not interested in discomfort for its own sake, and moved on. These moments were not sweet in the way that vindication is sometimes imagined to be sweet. She had anticipated in some remote part of herself that being proven right would feel like something she had earned and had waited for. Instead, it felt like nothing more than accurate. But the world had updated its assessment of a decision she had known was right when she made it, and the update felt like information rather than satisfaction. She had not needed the world's assessment to be accurate then. She did not need its correction now. What she did feel, and felt steadily, was a kind of interior settling. The specific peace of a person who has held a large and complex thing carefully for a long time and has arrived at the point where they can begin to set it down. On the 89th day, the lawyer called to tell her that no claim had been filed. His voice was the same on the phone as it was in person, measured, without drama, carrying information rather than emotion. She thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen of the Creel Street house for a moment with her hand still resting on the counter. And the next morning she drove to her daughter's school. She went not to the main entrance, but to the administration office, where she asked to speak with the school counselor. The counselor was a woman she had met twice before at events, young enough to still carry a quality of idealism that had not yet been tested by sustained disappointment. Miriam told her that she expected to be in a position within the next several months to make a contribution to the school's needs, whatever those needs were identified to be. She asked what was most lacking. The counselor blinked. She mentioned several things. Miriam wrote them down. On the drive home, she stopped at the elementary school and had a similar conversation with a different counselor. She wrote those things down, too. The legal completion came in stages, each stage accompanied by documents that required her signature and the lawyer's presence, and, toward the end, the presence of a tax specialist he had recommended, a woman who wore practical shoes and spoke about figures with the comfort of someone who had been on easy terms with large numbers for a long time. There were structures to establish, obligations to calculate, decisions to make about how and when and through what vehicle the assets would be transferred from their current state, authenticated bars in a vault beneath a condemned tower floor, into a form that could be applied to the actual texture of a human life. The lawyer guided her through all of it with the patience he had demonstrated from the beginning. He never made her feel that the questions she asked were beneath his expertise, even when she recognized that they sometimes were. He understood, she thought, that she was not asking about financial structures in the abstract. She was asking about the specific and practical difference between one option and another, as it would be experienced by a woman with 2 children and a rental house on Creel Street and a job cleaning offices at night. On the day that the final transfer was confirmed, the day that the number resolved from theoretical to actual, from assessed value to available resource, she did not celebrate in any way that was externally visible. She drove to Harmon Road. She parked where she always parked, at the edge of the property, and she sat in the car and looked at the tower. It was a clear day in late winter, the kind that suggests spring from a distance, but delivers cold up close. And the sky was bright and pale, and the tower stood against it the way it had always stood, assertively, with the particular authority of a structure that has been upright for long enough to have forgotten what it was like to be new. The rust on its surface caught the light differently in winter than in autumn. She had learned that, having looked at it often enough through the changing weather. She got out of the car and walked to the base. She put her hand on the northeast leg, at the footing where she had crouched on her first visit, and found the compressed grass hiding the tin box. The concrete was cold and rough under her palm. The cracks she had assessed on that first day were the same cracks. Everything above her was the same as it had always been. The tower did not know what had changed, and the iron did not feel the transfer of $308 million any more than it had felt the transfer of 8. She stood there for a while with her palm against the concrete and her face turned up toward the tank she could not see from directly below. She thought about the person who had built the vault, the careful and anonymous figure whose name appeared in a newspaper notice from decades ago and who had placed things of enormous value inside a structure that had no obvious connection to anything valuable. She thought about what that person had intended and what had prevented the intention from being completed. She would never know the full answer. The records did not reach that far with enough clarity. But she thought that whoever had placed those bars in that vault had done so with the belief that they would be retrieved, that the hiding was temporary, that the story was not finished. She thought about the note. What is in the floor is not the county's, and never was. It had not been the county's, and it had not been hers either, until a chain of improbable and ordinary events had placed her on the receiving end of a decision made by someone she had never met, in circumstances she could not fully reconstruct, for reasons that had dissolved into the past like so much else. She had not found the gold because she was deserving. She was not interested in that kind of story, the one where the universe distributes rewards on the basis of merit because merit is clearly visible to things that are not conscious. She had found it because she had looked at the ground as carefully as she looked at everything, because she had crouched down in compressed grass instead of scanning from standing height, because she had held a flashlight in her teeth and descended into a condemned tank on a cold morning when the simpler decision would have been to stand at the base and conclude that there was nothing worth knowing. The simpler decision was rarely the one that taught you anything. She removed her hand from the concrete and walked back to the car. The first thing she did, in the practical ordering of her new circumstances, was pay off what she owed. This was not a strategic decision. It was an instinct so deeply embedded that it required no deliberation. The accumulated weight of debt, not catastrophic, but constant, the kind that stays at shoulder height without ever quite reaching the neck, was the first thing she addressed because it was the thing she had felt most continuously for years, and she wanted to feel the absence of it before she did anything else. It took less than a morning. The calls were brief. The amounts were not large by the standards of what she now possessed, but they were precise, and the precision of them, the specific totals of everything she had owed, was something she had held in her memory so long that releasing them felt like setting down something she had carried so far. It had begun to feel like a part of her body. She paid the rent on the Creel Street house through the end of the month. Then she called the landlord in the other city and told him she would not be renewing the lease. His assistant was surprised. She was not. The house she bought was not large. This surprised people, she thought later, though no one said so directly. People who imagine receiving an enormous sum of money tend to imagine it expressed in scale. The largest house that can be obtained, the most visible evidence of a change in condition. She had never been interested in visibility as a measure of security. What she wanted was solidity. A house that would not be taken from her. A house with a roof that did not require negotiation, with windows that sealed properly, with rooms that her children could think of as permanent in a way that the rooms on Creel Street had never quite been. She found it in a quiet part of the county she had always liked without having had a particular reason to frequent. The house was older, but with good bones and the kind of interior light that comes from windows positioned by someone who understood where the sun would be throughout the day. There was a yard, not large but real, with an old fruit tree at the back that had not been properly tended in years and would require attention. She understood the appeal of things that required attention and rewarded it. She bought it outright. The transaction, conducted through the lawyer and the tax specialist and the appropriate financial structures, was the cleanest large thing she had ever done. No negotiating around what she could afford, no calculating the monthly cost against the monthly income and hoping the math held. She said what she wanted. The price was agreed. The papers were signed. The keys were handed over. She stood in the empty house on the afternoon of the purchase and walked through each room alone before the children saw it, the way she had walked the perimeter of the tower on her first visit, looking at everything carefully, noting what would need to be done, forming the quiet and practical relationship with the place that preceded belonging. Her children saw it that evening. Her son ran from room to room with the specific energy of an 11-year-old, assessing square footage for purposes that were important to him. Her daughter walked more slowly, as her mother had, touching surfaces, looking at the light. "The tree needs work," her daughter said, looking out at the backyard. "I know," Miriam said. "We could do it," her daughter said. "We could," Miriam said. They moved in on a Saturday in early spring, when the light was beginning to soften, and the air carried the first suggestion of warmth. She had not asked anyone to help, but help arrived anyway. Neighbors from the old street, her co-worker from the processing plant whose husband had stood in the vault and held the bars in a flashlight beam. People carried boxes without being directed. Someone brought food. The afternoon had a quality she had not anticipated, a kind of ease that was neither earned nor manufactured, but simply present, the way some days are present more fully than others. The contributions to the schools were made quietly and without ceremony, which was how she had planned it. The counselors received letters from the lawyer's office outlining the specifics, new equipment, updated resources. A fund designated for students whose circumstances required financial support for extracurricular participation. The specific kind of support she knew from direct experience could make the difference between a child who felt fully included in their own education and one who navigated it from the margins. She did not attach her name to the funds publicly. This was her choice, and she made it without ambivalence. The help was the point, not the acknowledgement of having helped. She had spent years receiving help that arrived without announcement. A supervisor who looked the other way on a late clock-in, a neighbor who brought food without making it an occasion, and she understood the particular dignity of assistance that does not require the recipient to perform gratitude before an audience. She did leave the janitorial job, and this required a conversation she had been composing for weeks in the back of her mind, in the spare moments between other tasks. She had liked the work itself more than most people assumed a person could like cleaning offices at night. There was satisfaction in it, in the specific and tangible evidence of before and after, in the way a task completed fully looked different from a task completed partially. She would miss that. She would not miss the clock-in system that docked minutes, or the 4-hour commute that her 2 jobs in combination had required across the working week. She gave notice professionally and without drama. The supervisor, who had twice offered advice she had not requested, accepted the notice with a warmth that suggested he was genuinely pleased for her, which surprised her more than she expected it to. She thanked him and meant it, and returned her equipment on her last day with the same care she had applied to everything she had touched in that building. The processing plant was different. The woman whose husband was Gerald, whose discreet assistance had been the first human bridge between discovery and confirmation, was there on her last day. They said goodbye in the parking lot, as they had said almost everything worth saying in that parking lot, in the cold air between shifts. "You knew," the woman said. Not an accusation, an observation. "I suspected," Miriam said. "I didn't know until Gerald looked." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always thought you were the most careful person I knew. I didn't understand why until now." Miriam considered that. "Careful is what you become," she said. "Oh, when you can't afford to be anything else." The woman nodded slowly, with the nod of someone who understood from her own history exactly what that meant. They embraced briefly, the embrace of people who are not natural huggers, but for whom the occasion exceeds the habit. Then they went to their separate cars. The tower remained. She had been asked about it by the lawyer and by others, what she intended to do with the property now that it had delivered its improbable contents. The expectation, she sensed, was that she would sell or demolish, that the land, modest as it was, would be absorbed into whatever the new circumstances required, and the structure itself would either come down or be transferred to someone else's care. She did not sell. Now, she engaged a structural engineer, a woman from the city who had been recommended by a professional network the lawyer moved within, to assess what the tower would actually require to be made sound. The assessment was completed over 2 visits and produced a report that was more optimistic than the county's condemnation had implied. The legs were compromised, yes, but not catastrophically. The northeast footing, the one with the deepest crack, required the most attention. The tank itself was structurally intact in ways that the external rust had obscured. The assessment concluded that with targeted work, the tower could be stabilized and preserved rather than demolished. She authorized the work. It was not inexpensive, but expense had a different character now than it had carried for the previous decade. As she sat across the table from the engineer and reviewed the scope of the proposed repairs, and asked questions until she understood what each line item meant in terms of the actual physical work that would be done to the actual physical structure, and the engineer answered with the patient specificity of someone who could tell that she was being heard rather than simply being paid. She did not have a plan yet for what the tower would become. She had time to think about that, which was itself a new condition. Having time. She had spent years in which every available moment was owed somewhere before it arrived. The experience of having time that was not pre-claimed felt strange and slightly disorienting, the way any long-held pressure feels when it is removed, not immediately like relief, but like the absence of a familiar weight, which the body takes some time to trust. She thought sometimes about what the vault had held for all those decades. Not the gold in the accounting sense, but the vault in the human sense. The idea that someone had built a room and placed something in it and expected to return and had not. She thought about the note and the key in the oilcloth and the particular quality of care that had gone into sealing them against a footing where they might wait for whoever came next with the right combination of patience and attention to find them. She thought about what it meant that the finding had been her, that of all the people who had passed the tower on Harmon Road over the years, who had driven by it or dismissed it or briefly entertained the idea of it before moving on. It had been a woman with $8 and a daughter who read county notices and a history of looking at the ground as carefully as she looked at everything above it. She did not think this meant the universe was fair. She knew too much about the specific texture of unfairness to believe that. She thought it meant something more modest and more true, that the things which appear worthless to those who look quickly sometimes reveal themselves to those who look slowly, that the difference between dismissed and overlooked is not in the thing itself, but in the quality of attention it receives, that $8 spent with attention is worth more than 800 spent without it. On a morning in late spring, but when the work on the tower had been underway for 3 weeks and the first of the repaired footings had been poured and was curing in the warming air, she drove to Harmon Road and parked and walked to the base of the structure. The construction fencing that surrounded the work area carried the name of the contracting firm in neat lettering. A worker she recognized from previous visits nodded from across the site. She stood where she always stood, at the base of the northeast leg. The new concrete of the repaired footing was a brighter gray than the old, its surface smooth and unmarked, a clean beginning laid against the compromised foundation it was reinforcing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up. The ladder ran from the ground to the platform, the same rungs, the same iron, unchanged by anything that had happened below. And the tank sat above her, round and present and rust-colored in the morning light, its surface given a faint warmth by the angle of the sun that she had learned to expect at this hour. She had climbed that ladder more times now than she could precisely count. She had stood on the platform in wind and in still air, in cold and in the first tentative warmth of spring. She had opened and closed the hatch enough times that the mechanism had grown familiar under her hand, responsive rather than resistant. She did not climb this morning. She only looked. The way one looks at something that has been central to a chapter of experience so specific and unrepeatable that looking is itself a form of preservation, an acknowledgement that the looking matters as much as what is seen. She had been asked by a reporter from the county paper, a young man, an earnest, his notepad already full of questions before she had agreed to anything, whether she wanted to tell her story. He had heard enough of the broad outline to know it was a story worth telling. She had asked him to give her time to think about it. She thought about it now, at the base of the tower, in the spring air. She thought about what the story was, not the gold. That was the surface of the story, the number that would appear in a headline and drive the interest of anyone who encountered it. The gold was real, and its value was real, and she did not diminish it. But it was not the story she wanted told. The story she wanted told was about the flyer on the kitchen table, about a daughter who read county notices, about $8 spent with attention. It's about the crouching down in the compressed grass that no one else had thought to do, not because they lacked the capability, but because they had already decided before they crouched that the grass had nothing in it worth finding. She wanted told the story about what happens when you refuse to accept other people's conclusions about the value of things they have not examined, about what happens when you bring to a dismissed and condemned and laughed-at object the same careful and patient attention you have spent years bringing to everything else because everything else required it. She had not bought the tower expecting gold. She had bought it because something in the combination of her particular history and her particular habits of mind had made it seem worth $8 of her attention. The attention had been the investment. Everything else had followed from it. She told the young reporter yes. The story ran in the county paper first, then was picked up in the way that unlikely stories are picked up when they carry within them the specific emotional charge of a truth that people recognize as larger than its details. It moved outward in a series of concentric circles, each repetition slightly different from the last, each version emphasizing a different aspect of the original facts. She did not read most of the versions. She read the first one and found it accurate enough, and then she moved on. Because there was a fruit tree in the backyard that needed attention, and her son had already formed strong opinions about the best approach to pruning it, and her daughter had developed an interest in the structural history of early 20th century industrial water infrastructure that Miriam found both unexpected and entirely in character. The tower was photographed by several publications. It appeared in print and online, the same structure that had stood on Harmon Road for decades, without generating any notable attention beyond the mild, dismissive kind. Now it generated the other kind. People drove out to look at it, parking where she always parked, standing where she had stood, and looking up at the tank with expressions she recognized from a particular angle as the specific human response to proximity to a large, improbable truth. And she watched this from a distance when she happened to be there without approaching. She understood what they were looking for. She was not sure what they found. What she had found was not a treasure in the storybook sense, though the word appeared in almost every headline. What she had found was the confirmation of something she had already known and practiced for years without the confirmation: that the quality of attention you bring to the overlooked determines what the overlooked reveals. That the condemned is not always the worthless. That the $8 decision made by the woman everyone expected to fail was not foolishness dressed as hope, but competence dressed as modesty, indistinguishable to those who had not thought to look closely enough. The claim period had passed. The bars had been authenticated, and the legal structures were established. The money was real and applied to real things: a house with a fruit tree, 2 children who would not navigate their education from the margins, a school that had what it needed, and a tower on Harmon Road that was being reinforced at its foundations so that it could continue to stand. She did not know yet what the tower would become. She thought sometimes about leaving it as it was, repaired but unchanged, standing at the end of Harmon Road for whoever drove past to see. She thought sometimes about something more deliberate: a use, a purpose, a second life that honored what the structure had quietly held for so long. She had time to decide. She had time for the first time in years that was not immediately owed somewhere else. She was learning what time felt like when it belonged to you, and when its passage did not mark an approach to the next crisis, but simply the movement of the world in its ordinary way. She sat on the back step of the new house one evening in late spring, her daughter reading beside her, her son somewhere inside making the specific noise of someone engaged in a project that had not yet been explained to anyone. The fruit tree at the back of the yard was beginning to show new growth along the branches she and her son had pruned the previous week. Small and green and entirely unremarkable, the kind of growth that most people would not stop to notice. She noticed. She always noticed. The light was the long amber light of the evening hour, the kind that settles over a yard and makes ordinary things seem briefly held, briefly illuminated before the day decides to let go of them. As she watched the light on the tree, she watched it move through the new leaves at the tips of the branches, the smallest and most recent growth, the evidence that something old had not stopped its work simply because it had been neglected. She thought about the vault. She thought about the bars in their careful rows, the oilcloth, the tin box, the key with its square head. She thought about the note in faded pencil, the handwriting of someone who had wanted to be understood and had been understood finally by someone they had never met, across a distance of decades. What is in the floor is not the county's, and never was. It had been waiting for her specifically, not because the universe had arranged it, not because merit distributes its rewards to those who have earned them most visibly, but because she had been the one to look, and that was all. She had looked where others had not. She had crouched when others had stood. She had spent $8 with more attention than most people spend on things worth several thousand times that. The gold was real. The $308 million was real. The new house was real. And the repaired footings on the northeast leg were real. And the accounts at the 2 schools were real. And the absence of the debt she had carried so long it had begun to feel like a feature of herself was real. But what she returned to, when she returned to anything, was something simpler than all of that. Something that lived not in the vault or the authentication report or the legal confirmation, but in the moment she had stood in a condemned water tower on a cold morning with a flashlight in her teeth and descended the interior ladder one rung at a time, with no certainty about what she would find and no company but her own attention. She had looked, and the world, which does not owe this kind of answer to anyone, had answered. She would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life in the same way she had carried everything else that mattered, quietly, without announcement, with a steadiness that people who had never needed to develop it might look at and call luck, because luck is the name we give to the outcomes of efforts we did not witness. The evening settled around the yard. The fruit tree held its new growth against the last of the light. Inside the house, the sound of her son's project continued, purposeful and absorbed, the sound of someone entirely at home in what they are doing. She had bought a condemned water tower for $8. What was in the floor had not been the county's, and now, at last, it was hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.